March 1558. England's first queen sits alone in her chamber, writing her final will. Mary Tudor's hand trembles as she pens the words, "Thinking myself to be with child." She makes provisions for the infant she believes will soon arrive, for the husband who will raise their heir, for the Catholic dynasty that will rule for generations. But the royal physicians know the truth. The court whispers it in shadows. There is no child. There never was. If you want to witness how a queen's desperate hope became her most haunting delusion, you need to see what happens next. England had never seen a queen rule alone. When Mary Tudor claimed her throne in July 1553, she was already 37 years old. In Tudor England, that was ancient for a woman who had never given birth. The clock was ticking, and everyone knew it. Her counselors were blunt. The realm needed an heir. A Catholic heir. Without one, everything she had fought for would crumble the moment she closed her eyes for the last time. Her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth waited in the wings like a vulture circling a dying animal. So Mary made a choice that would define her tragedy. She would marry Philip of Spain. It was a catastrophic decision from the start. The English people despised the idea of a foreign king. Rebellions erupted across the countryside. Thousands took up arms to stop the wedding. They saw it clearly. England would become a mere province of the Spanish Empire, drained of gold and young men to fight Philip's endless wars. But Mary didn't care about politics. For the first time in her miserable life, she believed she would be loved. Her childhood had been a nightmare of abandonment. When she was just 14, her father Henry VIII had cast aside her mother, Catherine of Aragon. Mary watched her mother die in exile, forbidden from seeing her. Henry declared Mary a bastard, stripped her of her title, forced her to serve as a maid to her infant half-sister. For years, he refused to speak to her, refused to even look at her. She had spent decades starving for affection. Now, at 37, a handsome prince 11 years her junior was coming to marry her. Philip was young, tall, golden-haired. She convinced herself this was God's reward for her suffering. The marriage treaty was drawn up to protect England's interests. Philip would have no real power. He could not rule if Mary died. He could not take English wealth back to Spain. But Mary, drunk on the fantasy of love, personally intervened to weaken these protections. She wanted to give him everything. They married on July 25th, 1554, at Winchester Cathedral. Mary wore a gown of rich purple velvet. Her eyes shone with desperate hope. Philip's eyes were cold and dutiful. His own advisers had been clear about his motivation. One wrote that the marriage was concluded for no fleshly consideration, but in order to remedy the disorders of this kingdom and preserve the Low Countries. Philip saw a political transaction. Mary saw salvation. She fell violently, pathetically in love with him. She watched his every movement, hung on his every word, showered him with jewels and lands and titles. He accepted them with the enthusiasm of a man receiving a bill. But Mary had one card left to play, one way to bind him to her forever, to prove her worth, to secure everything she had sacrificed for. She would give him a son. Mary did not have to wait long to believe her prayers had been answered. Only weeks after the wedding, her body began to change. Her courses stopped. Her breasts grew tender. Nausea swept over her in the mornings. She felt dizzy, heavy, strangely alive with a new purpose. In a world without pregnancy tests, these signs spoke louder than any physician. To Mary, they were not symptoms. They were miracles. The court physicians examined her and agreed. The queen was almost certainly with child. They measured her pulse, pressed careful hands against her abdomen, questioned her ladies about her sickness and cravings. One by one, they confirmed what she already wanted to hear. The news spread through the corridors of Whitehall like fire in dry straw. Servants whispered it. Ambassadors raced to send letters home. A Catholic heir, they said. England's future, at last, was secure. By the autumn of 1554, Mary moved more slowly. Her gowns were altered to accommodate a swelling belly. When she walked in procession, people craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of the curve beneath her heavy fabrics. She placed a protective hand over her stomach in a way no one had seen before. This was not just a queen. This was a mother. In November, she did what no Tudor monarch would do lightly. She made the pregnancy public. Standing before lords and bishops, she announced that God had blessed her marriage. She spoke of the child as a certainty, not a hope. The reaction was electric. Bells rang out across London. Priests gave thanks from their pulpits. After years of religious turmoil, the Catholic faithful saw this as a divine sign that their cause would endure beyond Mary's lifetime. Parliament moved quickly. Laws were drafted to prepare for the birth. If Mary died in childbirth, her husband would serve as regent for their child until the heir was old enough to rule. The realm was being reshaped around a baby that did not yet exist. Every decision, military, financial, religious, began to orbit this invisible center. Inside the palace, preparations grew more intimate, more tangible. Tailors worked on tiny garments embroidered with gold thread. Rocking cradles were ordered. Wet nurses were quietly identified and placed on standby. The royal nursery at Hampton Court, unused since the days of Henry's younger children, was cleaned and refitted for a new occupant. Fires burned constantly to keep the rooms warm in case the child arrived in cold weather. Mary watched all of this unfold with a kind of fierce, shining joy. At last, she had something no one could take away from her. Proof that God favored her, that her body was not useless, that her marriage was not just a political arrangement. She began to speak of the future with a certainty that made others hesitate to question her. As winter turned to spring, the court started to count down the weeks. The predicted due date drew closer. Horoscopes were cast. Pamphlets hinted that the child would be a boy. The queen withdrew more often to private chambers, resting, praying, listening for every flutter inside her. Everything Mary's faith, Philip's power, England's religious fate, now hung on a single expectation. The birth was coming. Or so everyone believed. By early 1555, anticipation had turned into obsession. The whole of Mary's court revolved around one date, the day the child would finally arrive. Astrologers had offered confident predictions. Midwives calculated the term from the time of Mary's last bleeding. Everyone agreed the birth would come in late spring. The question was not if, but when. At Hampton Court Palace, the transformation was complete. The nursery was ready, filled with carved cradles and embroidered cushions. Tapestries were chosen to keep out the drafts. Servants rehearsed the routes they would take from chamber to chapel, from chapel to council room, once the baby was safely born. For those inside the palace, the child already felt like a presence, hovering just out of sight. Then came the moment every Tudor queen both dreaded and desired: confinement. In late April, Mary withdrew from public view. According to custom, she entered a specially prepared birth chamber, windows shuttered, walls hung with rich fabrics, candles burning softly to create a warm, enclosed world. Only women were allowed inside, her ladies, midwives, and a select few attendants. The doors closed behind her. Outside, England waited. Days passed. Rumors grew. On April 30th, bells suddenly rang out across London. Bonfires were lit. Wine flowed in the streets. Word spread that the Queen had delivered a healthy son. Some preachers even praised the newborn prince from their pulpits, describing him as a sign of God's mercy. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the country celebrated a child that no one had seen. But inside the hushed chamber, there was only silence. No infant cries. No hurried footsteps of nurses rushing a swaddled body to the cradle. The women closest to Mary watched her anxiously. The pains she described were vague, inconsistent. Hours turned to days, and still no labor came. The physicians began to murmur about miscalculation. suggesting the due date must have been wrong. They spoke of late quickening, of a child that was simply taking longer than expected. Mary clung to those explanations. She had to. She had already imagined the face of her son, already pictured him crowned in Westminster Abbey, already seen in him the future of her faith and her father's fractured dynasty. To question the pregnancy now was to question everything. Her marriage, her body, her God. So she waited, confined in stifling heat, surrounded by the constant smell of candles and sweat, listening for signs that never came. Outside, the jubilation curdled into unease. The celebratory bells had stopped. Foreign ambassadors quietly asked for updates and received only evasive answers. Weeks dragged on. Whispers slipped through the corridors. Perhaps the Queen was ill. Perhaps the child had died. Perhaps there had never been a child at all. No one dared voice those doubts within Mary's hearing. As summer approached, the illusion grew harder to sustain. Her belly, once firm and pronounced, began to soften. The supposed movement she had described was less frequent, harder to distinguish from the ordinary workings of her own body. Court observers noted that her step had changed again, not the heavy, careful tread of late pregnancy, but the slow, exhausted gait of someone carrying a different kind of weight. Eventually, the preparations that had once hummed with hope fell quiet. The cradles remained empty. The tiny garments were folded away. Servants who had been assigned to the nursery slipped back into other duties. No formal announcement was made. There was no stillbirth to mourn, no little coffin to lower into the ground, no funeral rites for a lost prince. The whole episode simply faded, like smoke dispersing in the air. Yet for Mary, it did not vanish. It hollowed her. What the rest of the world treated as an embarrassing mistake, she felt as a private catastrophe. The promised child had not arrived, and she had no words to explain why. In the void left behind, something darker began to grow, a knowing fear that this was not just a misjudged term or a medical error, but a judgment. And in that fear, her mind started to turn toward an answer that would reshape the rest of her reign. When the hope of a prince finally slipped away, it did not happen with a single announcement or a single moment. It dissolved slowly, painfully, in the way people stopped speaking about the baby in front of her. Servants no longer bowed with congratulatory smiles. Courtiers who had once asked eagerly about her condition now avoided her eyes. The palace had been braced for the thunderclap of a royal birth. Instead, it was left with an awkward, echoing silence. Mary remained trapped inside the memory of those months. She remembered the bells that had rung for a child that never appeared, the sermons that praised a boy no one had ever seen, the preparations made in his name. It was as if the entire kingdom had conspired with her to build a future out of smoke. And when the illusion cleared, only she was left standing in the wreckage. Her ladies saw the change first. In the weeks after the due date passed and was quietly forgotten, Mary became withdrawn. She spent long hours in prayer, kneeling until her legs trembled, fingering her rosary until the beads dug into her skin. Meals went untouched. Her physicians worried about her growing weakness and urged her to eat, but she brushed them aside. Food meant life, and right now her body felt like something that had betrayed her. Yet she would not admit, even to herself, that she had never been pregnant. Instead, she clung to explanations that preserved some scrap of meaning. Perhaps the child had died early in the womb and been absorbed. Perhaps God had merely delayed his gift. Perhaps, in some mysterious way, this suffering was a test she was meant to endure. To Mary, it was unthinkable that she had simply been wrong. A queen of England, chosen by God, could not afford to be ridiculous. Around her, others tried to rationalize the failure in their own ways. Foreign ambassadors reported discreetly that the pregnancy had ended with what they called a false alarm. Some quietly mocked the situation, comparing it to other royal scandals. But close observers noticed something more disturbing. Mary began to speak less about the lost child and more about sin. Not her own, but the country's. If God had withheld an heir, then there had to be a reason. Mary's mind, shaped by years of devout Catholic teaching, turned naturally toward punishment and penance. She looked out at a realm still full of Protestant men and women who rejected the Mass, denounced the Pope, and clung stubbornly to the reforms of her father and brother. It was easier to see the lost baby as a divine warning than as a quirk of her own body. Her confessor and closest advisers did little to pull her away from that conclusion. They spoke of her mission, of England's need to return fully to the old faith, of the dangers of heresy. Their words fell on a heart already cracked by disappointment. The more Mary blamed the country's sins, the less she had to face the raw humiliation of her own misjudged hope. Philip's behavior deepened the wound. While he did not openly mock her, he did not linger by her side either. Once it became clear there would be no child, his visits to her chambers grew shorter, more formal. He devoted himself to councils, ambassadors, and letters back to Spain. Mary, who had once watched him like a woman dazzled by the sun, now often saw only the back of his cloak as he left the room. The court felt the chill spreading outward from the Queen. The failed pregnancy was never officially discussed, yet its shadow lay over every decision. Mary had staked not just her personal happiness, but her entire religious program on the arrival of an heir. Now, with no baby in the cradle and no clear promise of another chance, she turned to the only power she still fully controlled, the power to enforce faith. The next phase of her reign would not be driven by hope of a child, but by fear of divine wrath. The empty nursery at Hampton Court became more than just a quiet room. It was a symbol, a reminder of what she believed England had cost her. And in the darkness left by that absence, her resolve hardened into something far more unforgiving. From the outside, Mary's pregnancy looked exactly like the real thing. Her belly had swelled. Her periods had stopped. She complained of nausea, heaviness, strange fluttering sensations deep inside. Courtiers saw only what they expected to see: a middle-aged queen who had finally conceived. But inside Mary's body, something far more complex and far more tragic was taking place. Modern doctors have a name for it: a phantom pregnancy. In clinical terms, it is called pseudocyesis, a condition where a person is utterly convinced they are pregnant, and their body responds by mimicking pregnancy in frighteningly convincing detail. Hormones shift. The abdomen can enlarge. Breasts change. Even signs like morning sickness, cravings, and the absence of menstruation can all appear. The mind believes, and the body obeys. In Mary's case, her age made everything more confusing. At 37, she was standing at the edge of what her world saw as the end of childbearing years. Cycles can become irregular. Symptoms of hormonal upheaval can appear suddenly. A missed period for a woman in her 20s might raise questions. For a woman nearing 40 newly married, desperate for an heir, it could feel like absolute confirmation. Every small change became loaded with meaning. The stress she carried only deepened the illusion. Mary's entire reign, her marriage, even her sense of self, were tied to the idea of producing a child. That pressure does not just sit in the mind. It seeps into the body. Chronic anxiety and intense longing can disturb the delicate balance of the brain's hormone control centers. When those signals are disrupted, the body's reproductive system can misfire, turning psychological strain into very real physical sensations. Imagine the feedback loop she was trapped in. She wanted a baby more than anything. Her advisors, her priests, her people all expected it. Then her body began showing subtle changes: fatigue, queasiness, a late period. Each sign fed her hope. That hope triggered even more hormonal change, altering appetite, sleep, and menstrual patterns. With every new symptom, her certainty grew stronger, and with every surge of certainty, more symptoms followed. Belief and biology locked into a spiral that neither she nor her physicians could see clearly. There may also have been an underlying illness at work, something no Tudor doctor could diagnose. Conditions affecting the womb or ovary cysts, tumors, chronic inflammation can cause bloating, discomfort, and irregular bleeding. In an age before internal examinations or scans, a distended abdomen in a newly married queen did not raise suspicion of disease. It almost automatically meant pregnancy. Any pain or swelling was simply folded into the same story. The child must be growing. For Mary, this was the cruelest part. Her body was not lying to her in a simple way. It was sending mixed signals that any woman in her position, in her time, would have interpreted exactly as she did. Stopping her monthly bleeding, tightening her gowns around a thickening waist, giving her those strange internal sensations that felt so much like movement. Her flesh seemed to be promising exactly what her soul craved. By the time doubt should have crept in, it was already too late. The entire political machinery of England had arranged itself around her supposed condition. Laws were written. Ceremonies were planned. Prayers were offered for the safe delivery of the royal child. To question the pregnancy was to question the Queen, her doctors, and even the will of God. Surrounded by that chorus of certainty, Mary had almost no space left to listen to the one silent truth her body was hiding, that something was terribly wrong, and there was never a baby at all. If Mary had lived today, her body would have been scanned, her blood tested, her hormones measured and charted on glowing hospital screens. In the 1550s, all her physicians had were their hands, their eyes, and a set of beliefs rooted in religion and ancient texts. They could see her swollen belly, hear her describe the feeling of quickening, and observe her stopped periods. What they could not see was the hidden storm behind those signs, the deeper, medical mystery that may have been quietly destroying her from within. Modern historians and doctors looking back at her symptoms see a pattern that goes beyond stress alone. Some suspect that Mary might have suffered from a disorder of the glands that control the body's hormones, buried deep at the base of the brain. If that center misfires, the messages sent to the ovaries, womb, and breasts become tangled. A body can be pushed into mimicking pregnancy, even when there is no child. The breasts may change, the abdomen may swell, and the normal cycle of bleeding can stop completely. To a Tudor doctor, that combination was almost impossible to interpret as anything but conception. There is also the possibility of a growth, what today would be recognized as a tumor playing a silent role. Certain types of benign tumors can press on those hormonal centers, causing weight gain, fatigue, headaches, changes to hair and skin, and disruptions to fertility. Some of the descriptions of Mary in her final years hint at a woman whose appearance and energy were shifting in unsettling ways. Bloated features, thinning brows, relentless exhaustion. To the people around her, these were simply signs of age and strain. To a modern eye, they might point toward a physical disease that no one in her time had the language to name. Her abdomen, for instance, did not simply grow and then vanish like a prank of the imagination. It seems to have enlarged gradually, then reduced months later, suggesting something more than a passing illusion. Fluid retention, changes in muscle tone, or a mass in the abdomen could all have contributed to that change. Any of these would have been hidden beneath the stiff bodices and heavy skirts of royal clothing. When doctors laid hands on that rounded stomach, they weren't just feeling cloth and wishful thinking. They were feeling the genuine physical consequences of an internal imbalance. Then there is the pain and illness that followed. In the years after the first false pregnancy, Mary experienced recurring sickness, bouts of fever, and swelling, what her contemporaries called dropsy, a word used for the visible buildup of fluid in the body. Combined with the earlier abdominal swelling, some scholars see the outline of a more sinister condition, possibly affecting her womb or ovaries. A slow-growing disease in that part of her body would not only explain the physical discomfort and bloating, but also make it nearly impossible for her to carry a real child to term. None of this was clear to Mary. To her, every ache could be read as a sign that a baby was growing. Every wave of nausea felt like proof. not warning. The Tudor medical world reinforced that misunderstanding at every turn. Their tools were words like humors and vapors, not scans or biopsies. In a sense, Mary's tragedy was not just that her mind believed in a child who never existed. It was that her body may have been shouting the truth of a deeper illness, and no one around her knew how to listen. To understand why Mary's body betrayed her so completely, it is not enough to look at glands, organs, or tumors. You have to go back to the little girl watching her world collapse. Long before she was a queen waiting for a child, she was a daughter watching her parents' marriage torn apart in front of all Europe. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was pushed aside. Her father, once affectionate, turned cold. Mary was ordered to deny her own legitimacy, to accept that her mother had never truly been a wife, and that she herself was nothing more than a royal mistake. For years, Henry refused to see her. The king who had once doted on his pearl of the world would not even allow her to come into his presence. Servants were warned not to use her old title. Letters from her mother were intercepted. She was shuffled from household to household, forced into the humiliating position of serving in her baby half-sister's household like an ordinary attendant. Every message she received from her father's court carried the same demand: submit, yield, erase who you were. Those experiences did not simply wound her feelings. They carved scars into her sense of self. Mary learned that love, status, even her identity as a princess could vanish overnight. The one constant that remained to her was her faith. While her father remade the church to suit his desires, Mary clung fiercely to the old religion. The Mass, the saints, the authority of Rome, these were more than beliefs. They were anchors in a life that had been violently uprooted. Being a good Catholic was not just piety, it was survival. So when she finally became queen, she saw it not just as a political victory, but as a divine correction. God had restored what her father had broken. But there was still one gaping absence. She had no child, no family of her own, no proof that she could build something that would last beyond her fragile body. The need for an heir was political, but for Mary, it was also deeply personal. A baby meant she was not her mother's tragic ending, but the beginning of a new, redeemed line. In that light, her pregnancy becomes more than a medical anomaly. It reads like the mind's desperate attempt to heal an old fracture. The child she believed she carried was not just a future king or queen. It was the answer to every humiliation she had endured. It would silence the memory of being called illegitimate. It would vindicate her faith against her Protestant enemies. It would bind Philip to her in a way no treaty could. All of her past losses converged on that single hope. When a person with that history begins to suspect they are pregnant, the emotional stakes are almost unbearable. Each sensation, each flutter, each wave of sickness becomes charged with decades of unmet longing. Doubt is not just uncomfortable, it is intolerable. To question the pregnancy would mean reopening every buried hurt, the lonely years, the broken family, the fear that she was unworthy of love or legacy. Belief, by contrast, was soothing. It allowed her to rewrite her story in real time. In such a state, the line between body and mind blurs. The same brain that stores memories of abandonment also controls the release of hormones. The same heart that once ached for her mother now raced at the thought of her own child. Mary was not simply imagining a baby out of vanity or foolishness. She was a woman whose deepest wounds aligned perfectly with the one illusion her body could still offer, that after everything she had suffered, something new and pure was finally growing inside her. The cruelest part of Mary's ordeal was that, while her mind and body were locked in this private war, the one person she had hoped to anchor her new life to was already drifting away. Philip had never entered the marriage with the same hunger she felt. For him, England was a chessboard, not a love story. While she was counting imagined kicks and whispering prayers over a cradle that waited empty, he was counting troops, ships, and territories. At first, In the glow of the supposed pregnancy, he played his role. He stood beside her at ceremonies, accepted the congratulations of ambassadors, and allowed the fiction of a blissful royal couple to flourish. The promise of an heir made England more useful to him, more tightly bound to Spain's interests. But as weeks turned into months and no child appeared, that usefulness began to fade. The alliance he had married was starting to look unstable, and Philip was not a man who clung to broken bargains. Mary, however, did not see the distance for what it was, not at first. Every time he withdrew into councils, she could tell herself he was working for their future child. Every time he left her chamber early, she could imagine he was tired from the burdens of rule. Her need to believe in the pregnancy bled into a need to believe he still cherished her, even if the evidence was thin. Admitting that the baby was a delusion meant staring directly at the possibility that the marriage was one too. When the false pregnancy finally withered into a fact no one could deny, Philip's behavior hardened into something she could no longer ignore. He spent less time in England, more time pursuing his own wars and ambitions on the continent. Letters replaced presents. Formal messages replaced private comfort. Mary, who had once seen him as a living symbol of God's favor, now had to watch him slipping out of her orbit, just as her father had slipped away from her mother years before. The pattern was horribly familiar. A woman cast aside when her body failed to produce the desired heir. That echo cut deep. To Mary, it was not just a husband losing interest. It was history repeating itself on her own flesh. She had become, in a twisted way, the mirror of the woman she had spent her life mourning, Catherine of Aragon, put away when no more sons came. The difference was that Mary could not direct her anger at a living rival like Anne Boleyn. Instead, she turned it towards something more abstract and more terrifying: sin, heresy, disobedience to God. Philip's absence created a vacuum, and into that space flowed harsher voices. Advisors who urged firmness, clergy who spoke of cleansing the land, courtiers who whispered that God might be withholding blessings because England still tolerated those who rejected the old faith. With no child to protect, no shared domestic happiness to soften her, Mary poured her remaining devotion into the one thing that had never abandoned her, her religion. In that sense, the failure of her body and the coolness of her husband did more than break her heart. They redirected the full force of her wounded faith outward onto her subjects. The queen, who had once waited in a darkened chamber for the cries of a newborn now, listened instead for the sound of a different kind of obedience, prayers said in Latin, altars rebuilt, heresy recanted. What she could not create in a nursery, she would try to forge in a nation, even if it meant becoming the kind of ruler history would remember with a single bloody name. 2 years had passed since the bells rang for a prince who never existed. 2 years since Mary's body had betrayed her, and Philip had quietly slipped across the sea back to his Spanish territories. She spent those years ruling a country that increasingly resented her, burning men and women who would not bend to Rome, and waiting, always waiting, for him to come back. In March 1557, that wait finally ended. Philip returned to England, and for a brief, fragile moment, Mary allowed herself to believe that the nightmare might be reversing itself. Perhaps God was granting her a second chance. Perhaps this time, things would be different. She greeted him with the same desperate affection she had shown on their wedding day, her eyes still lit with the kind of hope that refuses to learn from pain. But Philip had not crossed the channel for her. He came because he needed something England could give him: soldiers, ships, money. Spain was locked in a brutal war with France, and Philip's coffers were running dry. He needed all eyes, and a marriage contract made England technically obligated to help. So he returned, not as a husband longing for his wife, but as a commander recruiting troops from a reluctant kingdom. Mary's council saw it clearly. They urged caution, reminding her that England had no quarrel with France and no interest in bleeding for Spain's ambitions. The country was still reeling from religious turmoil, economic strain, and the bitterness left by her harsh enforcement of Catholic orthodoxy. Dragging the realm into a foreign war would risk everything. But Mary, blinded by the sight of Philip sitting beside her once again, overruled them all. She threw England's support behind Spain. Troops were levied. Ships were prepared. Taxes were raised to fund a campaign that most of her subjects saw as pointless. The cost was immediate, but the consequences would be even worse. In January 1558, French forces struck back, and England lost Calais, the last remnant of its once great holdings in France. It was a wound that cut deep into national pride. Calais had been English for over 200 years. Losing it felt like the final proof that Mary's reign was cursed. Rumors swirled that during this visit, Philip had done something even more calculating. Whispers in the court suggested he had quietly begun courting Elizabeth, Mary's Protestant half-sister, and the woman who would inherit the throne if Mary died childless. If the whispers were true, it meant Philip was already planning for a future that did not include Mary at all. He was hedging his bets, preparing to preserve Spanish influence even after the queen he had married was gone. Mary must have sensed it, even if no one dared say it aloud. The way he moved through the palace felt different this time, less like a husband returning home and more like a diplomat making a necessary stop. Yet she clung to the only path she knew. She would try again. She would give him what he wanted. She would prove her worth. And perhaps, just perhaps, her body would finally cooperate. So once again, in that spring of 1557, Mary began to feel the signs. The familiar tightness in her belly, the absence of her courses, the sensation that made her place a cautious hand over her stomach in private, afraid to speak the hope out loud, but unable to let it go. The second phantom had begun to grow. The second time it began, Mary did not rush to proclaim it. The memory of the first humiliation still hung over the court like a lingering fog. No one had forgotten the empty nursery, the vanished due date, the way the celebrations had silently died. So when her body once again began to change in 1557, she moved with more caution, as if afraid that speaking the words would break the spell. The signs, however, felt horribly familiar. Her monthly bleeding stopped. Her abdomen thickened. Fatigue settled over her bones. The same sensations she had once interpreted as the stirrings of life returned, and with them came an old, dangerous hope. This time, she told herself, there would be no mistake. God would not be so cruel as to tease her twice. After everything she had endured, the false pregnancy, the rebellions, the war, the loss of Calais, surely a child, was the mercy waiting at the end of the storm. Those closest to her saw the pattern, but were trapped. Her ladies noticed her resting more, holding herself carefully when she walked, laying a protective hand across her middle during private moments. Her physicians recorded her symptoms, and once again found no easy way to challenge her interpretation. In a queen, especially a queen so devout, conviction carried its own authority. To openly deny her belief would not just be a medical correction. It would feel like questioning her relationship with God. Most simply lacked the courage. Yet the atmosphere was different from the first time. There was no triumphant public announcement, no ringing of bells at the first whisper of pregnancy. The government moved cautiously. Preparations for a birth were quieter, more restrained, almost secretive. It was as if the entire machinery of the state had learned from the previous disaster and was now holding its breath, afraid to commit itself to a story that might dissolve again. Mary, too, must have felt that tension. On one side was the crushing need to believe that her body was finally doing what it was meant to do. On the other was the remembered sting of disappointment, the way the world had looked at her after the first phantom, half with pity, half with ridicule. She lived suspended between those two memories, the ecstasy of thinking she carried an heir, and the emptiness of realizing she did not. To keep moving forward, she had to lean harder into faith than ever before. But her body was not cooperating with the neat narrative she wanted. The swelling in her abdomen did not follow the expected rhythm. Pain, discomfort, and illness began to intrude on the story she was trying to tell herself. What had once felt like soft, mysterious quickening sometimes blurred into the dull ache of disease. Instead of the vibrant anticipation of a woman awaiting birth, there were days when she looked simply unwell drained, bloated, worn down. Outside her chambers, the political stakes of her condition only grew sharper. If there was no child again, England's future would almost certainly pass to Elizabeth, the very figure Mary's entire religious program was meant to block. Every hint of pregnancy pushed that possibility back into the shadows. Every hint of doubt brought it closer. Courtiers watched her closely, not just out of concern, but out of calculation. Their fortunes would rise or fall on whether that hidden life existed or not. Through it all, Mary clung to the one thread she had left, the belief that she and Philip still might produce the heir that would justify everything. The war, the burnings, the sacrifices, the years of loneliness, none of it would feel wasted if a child emerged from the wreckage. And so, even as her health faltered and the whispers returned, she held to the same fragile conviction that had once filled Hampton Court with cradles and tiny embroidered gowns. Only this time there were no premature celebrations, no fireworks in the streets, just a queen whose body was slowly failing her, quietly insisting that somewhere beneath the pain and swelling, a miracle was still trying to be born. If the second pregnancy began in a haze of fragile hope, its turning point arrived with the sound of departing footsteps. On July 3rd, 1557, Philip left England again, this time with no illusion that he might truly return to build a life with his wife. Officially, he was called away by war and duty. Unofficially, everyone understood. His priorities lay across the sea, not beside the woman who still called herself his devoted queen. For Mary, the day carved a new wound over an old scar. She had spent her childhood watching her father walk away from her mother, trading a long, faithful marriage for a younger wife and the promise of sons. Now, standing in the shadow of the second phantom pregnancy, she watched another husband disappear, leaving behind a body that once again refused to give him the heir he wanted. History was not just repeating. It was closing around her like a trap. The court read the moment with cold clarity. Philip's departure meant England was now bearing the cost of his war with France largely alone, with no royal child in sight to make the sacrifice feel worthwhile. Calais had fallen. Treasure had been spent. Blood had been shed. And in the Queen's chambers, there was still no cradle, no new generation to justify the pain. Her supposed pregnancy, once a symbol of hope, now looked more like a sad rumor clung to by a woman being quietly abandoned. Mary felt the shift. After Philip sailed, the palace seemed to grow larger and emptier around her. Corridors that had once hummed with preparations for a royal birth now echoed with the thin, everyday sounds of servants and guards. The air of tense anticipation that had followed her movements gave way to something worse: pity. People lowered their voices when she passed. They stopped asking gentle questions about her health. Some avoided her entirely, as if the disappointment surrounding her were contagious. Yet she could not simply let go of the belief that she was carrying his child. To admit the truth would be to confess that she had been left with nothing: no husband at her side, no heir in her womb, no victory in war, no guarantee that her faith would outlive her. So she remained suspended in a strange, painful in-between state, outwardly a queen whose body was expecting, inwardly a woman whose strength was being eroded by illness, loss, and shame. Her health continued to slide. The swelling that had once seemed like the curve of late pregnancy began to look more like the bloat of disease. Pain settled in her abdomen and limbs. She tired easily, struggled with fever and fluid retention. But because those symptoms overlapped with what people expected from a woman about to give birth, they were easily misread or willfully ignored. It was safer, for everyone, to pretend they were watching a difficult pregnancy than to confront the possibility of a dying queen. Meanwhile, the political clock kept ticking. With each day that passed without a child, Elizabeth's shadow loomed larger over the future of the crown. Some nobles began quietly reaching out to the younger sister, measuring their distance from Mary in case the wind changed. Others stayed loyal but increasingly anxious, knowing that the realm could not drift forever in uncertainty. Every time Mary insisted that she still believed herself to be with child, it postponed the reckoning, but it did not erase it. Philip's absence turned that denial into something even more tragic. The imagined baby became not just a symbol of faith or duty, but her last emotional tie to a man who had moved on. As long as she believed there was a child, a part of him remained with her in more than name. When she finally allowed herself to face the reality that no birth would come, she would also be admitting that he had truly gone, that their story had ended not in renewal, but in quiet abandonment. By the time the year after his departure drew to a close, the second phantom had done its slow, cruel work. It had drained her physically, isolated her politically, and left her clinging to a hope that fewer and fewer people around her shared. The next stage of her life would not be defined by waiting for a child, but by something far more final. Preparing at last to meet the God she believed had tested her almost beyond endurance. By the spring of 1558, more than a year had passed since Philip's final departure, and the truth Mary had tried so hard to suppress was no longer avoidable. Her body was failing. The swelling had not delivered a child. It had deepened into sickness. Fever came and went. Her skin took on a grayish pallor. She moved slowly through the palace, each step weighed down by fatigue and the relentless ache that settled into her bones. The court knew. The council knew. Even her most devoted attendants knew. But Mary herself held to one last, desperate fiction. On March 30th, 1558, she sat down to write her will. It was not the first time she had drafted such a document, but this version carried a particular kind of weight. She knew her time was running short, and yet the words she put to paper reflected a reality that existed nowhere but in her own mind. In the will, she described herself as being pregnant. She made careful provisions for the child she expected to deliver, detailing how the baby should be raised, who would serve as guardians, and how Philip would act as regent until the heir came of age. It was heartbreaking in its specificity. She wrote as if planning for a nursery that would soon need filling, for advisors who would guide a prince or princess through childhood, for a future shaped by the dynasty she still believed she would create. Every line of the document was an act of faith or perhaps an act of refusal. To write the will any other way would be to admit that she had lived through 2 false pregnancies, that her marriage had been hollow, that her reign would end with no legacy but ashes. Her attendants watched this unfolding with a kind of helpless sorrow. There was no child. There had not been a child for over a year, if there had ever truly been one at all. The symptoms she clung to, swelling, discomfort, the strange sensations in her abdomen, were not signs of life growing, but signs of life draining away. What she interpreted as the movements of an unborn baby were more likely the effects of disease, tumors, cysts, fluid pressing against weakened organs. Her body was giving her signals, but she had spent so long reading them as promises that she could no longer hear them as warnings. Those around her faced an impossible choice. To confront her openly would be an act of cruelty toward a woman already drowning in grief and illness. To remain silent was to allow her to live in a delusion that made her final months even more isolating. Most chose silence, speaking around her belief rather than through it, letting her carry the fiction as long as she needed to, even as the machinery of succession quietly prepared for Elizabeth. In those last weeks, Mary began to accept that something was deeply wrong, but she could not bring herself to name it clearly. She spoke in vague terms about God's will, about mysteries beyond human understanding, about suffering that would be redeemed in another life. She stopped making grand pronouncements about the child's arrival, but she did not retract the provisions in her will. The document remained as she had written it, a testament to a baby that would never be born, a future that would never arrive. Her denial was not stubbornness or madness in a simple sense. It was survival. As long as she could imagine that a child might still come, she did not have to face the full scale of her defeat. She did not have to see herself as the woman history would remember, not as a mother or a restorer of faith, but as a queen who had burned her people, lost her husband, failed her God, and died clinging to a dream that her own body could not sustain. In the end, that will become one of the most tragic documents in English royal history, not because of what it commanded, but because of what it revealed. A woman so broken by loss that even on the edge of death, she could not let go of the one hope that had kept her moving forward. She signed her name beneath words that described a pregnancy no one else could see, and in doing so, she sealed her legacy not with triumph, but with an aching, unshakable refusal to surrender. By the summer of 1558, the illusion of new life had given way to the unmistakable signs of approaching death. Whatever Mary's body had been hiding, whether a disease of the womb, the ovaries, or something deeper, was now openly consuming her. Her legs and abdomen swelled with fluid. Walking even short distances left her gasping for breath. The woman who had once ridden out to rally her supporters with fiery speeches now struggled to cross a room without assistance. The courtiers who saw her in these last months were looking at a queen already half claimed by the grave. Illness did not strike only her. That year, a fierce wave of sickness swept through London and the surrounding regions, what many believed to be an outbreak of influenza. People collapsed with fever, coughing, and weakness. Among the victims was Cardinal Reginald Pole, Mary's closest spiritual ally, and the man who had helped steer England back toward Rome. As her own health faltered, she watched the very figure who embodied her religious mission begin to fail as well. It felt, to those who believed in omens, as if the entire Catholic revival in England were sickening alongside its queen. Inside the palace, the atmosphere shifted from anxious waiting to somber preparation. The hope of a royal birth had faded completely. Now the question was not whether Mary would produce an heir, but what would happen when she died without one. Counselors who had once drafted laws for a future child now quietly turned their attention to Elizabeth. Papers were drawn up, plans considered, messages prepared for the smoothest possible transfer of power. They did this carefully, out of Mary's sight, knowing how deeply it would wound her to see the machinery of her own succession turning in her final days. Mary felt the betrayal without needing to see the documents. She could sense it in the way people spoke to her, in the cautious, measured sentences, in the way conversation tilted away from the future she had always imagined. Yet even as she weakened, she refused to name Elizabeth outright in open defiance of everything she had fought for. Instead, she took a more indirect path. When pressed, she agreed that the crown should pass according to the lawful line of succession, the very order that placed Elizabeth next in line. It was a bitter compromise, an admission that she could not bend reality any further to her will. Pain became her constant companion. Swelling, what her contemporaries called dropsy, made lying down difficult and breathing labored. Fever flared and faded. She endured it with the same rigid, inward-turned faith that had carried her through humiliation and false hope. To some around her, it seemed as if she welcomed suffering, seeing it as a purifying fire that might atone for her failures in God's eyes. Confessors came and went. Masses were said for her soul, even while she still clung to life. The palace corridors filled with the low murmur of prayers. Outside, England had already started to look past her. Merchants, nobles, and commoners alike were quietly adjusting to the idea of a new reign one that would almost certainly reverse Mary's religious policies. For those who had lost loved ones at the stake, her decline felt like a grim kind of justice. For her supporters, it was a heartbreak tinged with dread. They knew that with Mary's passing, the fragile restoration of Catholicism would likely shatter. All the altars rebuilt, all the ceremonies restored, all the risks taken in her name might vanish in a few strokes of her sister's pen. Mary herself understood this all too well. In her final months, she was not just watching her life ebb away. She was watching the collapse of everything she believed she had been put on the throne to do. No child to inherit her faith. No husband at her bedside. No lasting grip on the soul of her kingdom. The woman who had once told herself that God had restored her to her rightful place now faced the possibility that her reign had been a brief, painful interruption. A flicker of old faith that would be snuffed out the moment she closed her eyes. It was in this state, physically ruined, politically cornered, spiritually exhausted, yet still clinging to ritual, that Mary entered the last stretch of her story. The hallucinated child was gone, but its absence haunted everything around her. The empty nurseries, the unneeded cradles, the unsigned future. All that remained was the final act, when the queen who had lived convinced she carried new life would instead surrender her own. The end came on a cold November morning. In the early hours of November 17th, 1558, Mary Tudor lay in her chamber at St. James's Palace, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyal attendants and clergy. Outside, London shivered under a gray sky, gripped by a wave of sickness that had already filled churchyards and choked the narrow streets with the smell of damp earth and fresh graves. Inside, the woman who had once been the living symbol of England's Catholic hope was now barely more than a whisper beneath her bedclothes. In her final days, Mary drifted in and out of consciousness. Fever blurred the edges of the room. Fluid pressed against her lungs, making each breath a labored effort. Those who kept vigil by her bedside reported that she clutched rosary beads almost constantly, her fingers moving even when her voice failed. Priests murmured Latin prayers at the foot of her bed. Candles burned low, turning the walls into a flickering ocean of shadow. The great machinery of monarchy had shrunk down to a single fragile body fighting a losing battle against time. Outside that darkened chamber, the world was already changing. Messages had been prepared, horses readied, plans laid for the moment the Queen finally slipped away. Elizabeth's supporters waited for the signal that would send them into motion. The same courtiers who had once bowed to Mary as the savior of the old faith now measured their words carefully, eager not to be caught on the wrong side of history when the crown changed hands. For them, the question was no longer, will she recover? But has she died yet? Mary herself seemed to sense the tide turning, even if she could not halt it. In rare lucid moments, she spoke of her mother, of the old Mass, of the hope that God would forgive her sins. Some accounts suggest she believed her illnesses were punishments she had willingly accepted for trying to restore what her father had broken. Others describe her as resigned, too tired to argue with fate any longer. The fierce certainty that had driven her earlier years had cooled into something quieter, a grim, almost numb acceptance. When the news of Mary's death finally settled over England, it did not bring a single clear emotion. It split the country along the same fault lines that had defined her reign. In some circles, black cloth and genuine tears marked the passing of a queen who, in their eyes, had tried to heal the wound her father had opened with Rome. In others, her death was met with thinly veiled relief, a sense that a long, dark chapter was closing, and that the country might finally step out from under the weight of fire and fear. Mary's own sense of her legacy, if she could have seen it, would have been devastating. She had come to the throne believing God had chosen her to restore the old faith, to undo the damage of Henry, and Edward to bring England back into the Catholic fold for generations to come. Yet within hours of her last breath, that vision was already crumbling. Elizabeth, the Protestant half-sister she had once been forced to accept into the succession, was proclaimed queen. Where Mary had rebuilt altars and restored Latin masses, Elizabeth would soon order them torn down again, replacing them with a new, carefully controlled Protestant settlement. In the decades that followed, Mary's image hardened into something she never intended. Pamphleteers and later, Protestant historians would give her a name that still clings to her story: Bloody Mary, the queen who burned nearly 300 people for their religious beliefs. Those executions, men and women tied to stakes, flames rising around them, became the defining image of her rule in popular memory. The complexity of her life, the traumas of her childhood, the desperation of her phantom pregnancies, all were flattened into a single brutal reputation. She was remembered not as a woman who suffered deeply, but as a monster who made others suffer more. Yet beneath that label, a more human tragedy remained. Mary died without the things she had craved most: a child to hold, a husband who loved her, a country that saw her as a savior instead of a scourge. The phantom pregnancies that had once filled her with hope became, in hindsight, symbols of everything she had lost, promises that never materialized, futures that dissolved the moment she tried to grasp them. Even her greatest victory, the temporary return of Catholicism, proved to be a brief interlude rather than a lasting transformation. Under Elizabeth, England's identity would tilt firmly toward Protestantism, and Mary's efforts would be recast as a violent, futile attempt to turn back a tide no one could stop. And yet, for all of that, her story refuses to fit neatly into villainy. She was a woman shaped by abandonment, humiliation, and fear, ruling in a world built for men, carrying the weight of an entire faith on shoulders already bowed by private grief. Her cruelty cannot be excused, but it can be understood as the dark flowering of a life that had taught her, again and again, that love and security were things granted only conditionally and easily ripped away. In the end, Mary Tudor became a cautionary figure, not just about religious fanaticism, but about what happens when a lifetime of unhealed wounds and impossible expectations are bound up in one fragile human body. Mary Tudor's story doesn't end with her last breath. It lingers in an empty space, a missing child, a broken line, and that absence is where the real horror of her life settles in. She died believing there was still time, still a chance that the shape beneath her ribs might yet be a son or daughter who would carry her faith forward. But when she was laid out for burial, there was no infant coffin beside her, no tiny body to justify the hope she clung to, until almost the last page of her will. In Westminster Abbey, they placed her not alone, but in a position that would become the final twist of her story. Years later, Elizabeth, the half-sister Mary had feared and tried to block from the throne, would be buried in the same tomb. Two queens who had spent their lives on opposite sides of a religious war, lying together in a shared monument. Above them, an inscription praising Elizabeth as a restorer of religion and peace would overshadow Mary's memory. Even in death, her narrative was overwritten, her presence reduced to a name beneath another woman's glory. Yet if you look closely, her ghost is still there, in the spaces where something should have been and never was. In the royal line of succession, where no child of hers appears. In the churches that reverted back to Protestant worship, where her restored altars survived, only as brief interruptions in a longer story. In the history books that remember her more for fire than for the years she spent as a terrified girl, a rejected daughter, a queen who mistook the screams of her own failing body for the stirrings of life. Her phantom pregnancies become, in the end, the perfect metaphor for her reign. Twice, she prepared the realm for a future that would never arrive. Twice she believed so fiercely in that unseen child that laws were written and lives rearranged around it. And twice, the promise dissolved, leaving behind only embarrassment, whispered mockery, and a woman more alone than before. The same thing happened to her grand project for England, a Catholic destiny carried as if it were inevitable, only to vanish within moments of her death, replaced by a different faith that would define the country for centuries. That is where the darkest chill of her story lies, not in the pyres, not in the politics, but in the image of a queen staring into a void and insisting it is full. Mary Tudor died with a kingdom that was slipping through her fingers, a husband who had already turned away, and a womb that had never given her what she needed most. But in her mind, right up until the ink dried on her final will, there was still a child on the way. She left this world clinging to a life that never existed, and for the rest of history, that unseen, impossible child has haunted her name more effectively than any ghost.